He was a lucky man, a lucky coach.
Mallorca, 2017. Rafael Nadal, 14 Grand Slams deep, 3 Roland Garros titles in the last 4 years, the most decorated clay court player who ever lived, is sitting somewhere on the island knowing something has to change. His uncle, his coach, the man who put a racket in his hands when he was 3 years old and stood in his corner for every single match of his professional life for the next 14 years. Toni Nadal, the man who built him, and Toni steps back. No ultimatum, no 48-hour deadline, no contract demand with conditions attached, no non-sporting clauses. Toni told Spanish radio later, simply, without drama, that he stopped coaching Rafael because he felt he couldn't contribute anymore. His words, "The job of a trainer is to make yourself dispensable. I think I did it. 27 years, 16 Grand Slams. And the ending was quieter than most people's Monday mornings." Now hold that image, because 8 years later, in December 2025, Toni Nadal is sitting in a radio studio, El Larguero, Cadena Ser, watching a completely different kind of split unfold. Same sport, same country, different family, and a very different set of circumstances. Carlos Alcaraz has just ended his 7-year partnership with Juan Carlos Ferrero. No mutual understanding, no player stepping back to say thank you. Ferrero gets 48 hours to review a contract. He doesn't sign. The split is announced 6 days after Ferrero was named ATP Coach of the Year. 6 days. Toni Nadal is asked what happened, and he says, carefully, in the way that men who know the sport intimately tend to say the most important things, that the split was not about tennis, that it was personal, that from the outside, it seemed like Alcaraz's environment made the call. The environment. That word is doing a lot of work. Because when you map the terrain of that environment, the man who travels with Carlos to most tournaments, the academy being built 60 miles from Ferrero's base, the reported arguments going back years, one figure keeps appearing at the center of the frame, Carlos Alcaraz Sr. This video is about what Toni Nadal actually said, what he was really pointing at, and whether the man who introduced his son to tennis, who sacrificed his own playing career to build a club, who watched Ferrero take his kid and make him the best player in the world, whether that man, at the critical moment, made a decision that was about his son's future, or his own. Start with what Toni Nadal actually said, because most of the coverage around this story pulled 1 or 2 lines and left the rest on the floor. Read the full picture across El Larguero, Clay, and RG Media, and what emerges isn't a polite non-answer. It's a surgical dissection from a man who spent 27 years inside the most demanding coaching relationship in tennis history and knows exactly what he's looking at. He said the split surprised him, said he would have liked them to continue. Then, and this is where it gets sharp, he said, "It is true that now the player has much more authority than before." Not used to have, has. Present tense. The shift wasn't something that happened at the split. It was already in motion, had been for a long time. Everyone inside Spanish tennis knew it, nobody was saying it out loud. Then he said the reasons go beyond tennis, that it was a contractual or rather personal matter. And then the line that Spanish media tried to use to clear Alcaraz of all responsibility, and that Toni Nadal refused to accept. I understand that nothing is done without Carlos's approval, of course. Read that carefully. He's not blaming Alcaraz. He's not protecting him either. He's drawing a map. Ferrero wasn't fired by a shadow council operating behind Carlos's back. The player signed off. But, and this is the distinction Toni is too careful to state directly, signing off and initiating are two very different things. Then came the line about the 48-hour window. To Clay and RG Media, Toni said, "I've been told that they gave him a contract and that he had to respond within 48 hours. It's a bit strange after a 7-year relationship to be rushed into making such decisions." That's not analysis, that's a verdict. From one of the most respected coaching minds in the sport. Quietly devastating. And it raises the question nobody in the Spanish tennis press wanted to ask directly: who drafted that contract? Who set the 48-hour clock? Who decided that 7 years of work deserved 2 days of consideration? To answer that, you need to understand who Carlos Alcaraz Sr. actually is. Not the smiling figure in the stands, not the proud father in the player's box, the full picture. Carlos Alcaraz Gonzalez, Carlos Sr., peaked at a world ranking of 963 in 1990. A nationally ranked junior in Spain who had to abandon his professional ambitions because his family couldn't sustain the costs. That is not a footnote, that is the foundation of everything that follows. The man who couldn't afford to keep playing gave his son a racket at 4 years old, built a club his own father had originally founded, the Real Sociedad Club de Campo de Murcia in El Palmar, and spent decades running it. Tennis was his first love, his sacrifice, his identity, his unreachable door. Then his son kicked that door off its hinges. Think about what that does to a man. Not in a dark way, in a human way. You gave up your dream. You built something with your father's foundation. You introduced your kid to the sport at 4 years old, and then watched another man, at another academy 60 miles away, take that kid and make him the best player on the planet. 6 Grand Slams, 24 titles, the career Grand Slam at 22, all built inside Ferrero's system, at Ferrero's Equilate, in Villena, not El Palmar. Carlos Sr. reportedly kept deliberate distance from his son's training in the early years. Didn't want to mix the roles of father and coach. Let Ferrero have the court. That restraint held for a while. By February 2023, a full year and a half before Cincinnati, 2 years before the split, reports from Clay and RG Media surfaced a heated argument between Ferrero and Alcaraz's father. The specifics weren't published, but the existence of that argument tells you something important. The tension wasn't new. It wasn't a December 2025 problem. It was a slow build, a pressure system gathering for years before it broke open. And while that pressure was building, something else was being constructed in El Palmar. The Carlos Alcaraz Tennis Academy, built and promoted by Carlos Sr., growing in profile directly alongside his son's career. By June 2024, right in the middle of Alcaraz's peak years, right before Cincinnati, right as the internal friction was accelerating, local Spanish radio was already reporting the academy was in full growth. 60 miles from Ferrero's Equilite. 60 miles is not an accident. You don't build a rival infrastructure 60 miles from your son's coach if you're content with the current arrangement. You build it because you're planning for a different one. Ferrero's public response to questions about the academy was careful, diplomatic. He said it's logical that he wants to have his own academy and be at home more. Logical. That word. Ferrero chose it precisely. It's the word you use when you're trying to be gracious about something that is quietly eating the foundations of your working relationship. The academy wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a parallel tennis infrastructure bearing Alcaraz's name, controlled by his father, growing in the same town where Carlos first picked up a racket. It said, "We are building something here, without you." Then came the Netflix documentary, My Way. Early 2025, and for the first time the public got a clear window into what the team dynamic actually looked like. Ferrero demanding structure, Alcaraz visibly restless under it, the commercial world pressing in from every angle, sponsorships, appearances, the Ibiza trips, the Formula One paddock visit after the 2024 US Open that Ferrero explicitly advised against. Carlos Sr. traveling to most tournaments, present, watching. The entourage expanding around a 22-year-old who was, by any measure, the most powerful tennis player on the planet. Ferrero's voice was becoming one among many where it had once been the only voice that mattered on a court. Toni Nadal, watching all of this from the outside, made a pointed comparison when asked about his own approach with Rafa. He said he told his nephew from age 18, "Do as you wish, but I won't indulge you." He handed responsibility back. He also said, in the same breath, pointedly, unmistakably, Rafa was responsible enough not to stay out until 3 in the morning. He didn't name who he was comparing that to, he didn't need to, but Toni also said something that demands to be heard clearly, because it's the honest counterweight this story requires. I do not think it was the player's decision, explicit, multiple times. Alcaraz gave his approval. He didn't drive the decision. In Toni's reading, the initiative came from somewhere else inside that environment. The player signed the permission slip, someone else wrote it, and then December arrived, the contract landed on Ferrero's table. 48 hours, non-sporting clauses, conditions about the professional direction of Alcaraz's career, which means conditions about who controls that direction going forward. Ferrero told Marca he had already planned the full 2026 preseason, had already mapped the Australian Open preparation. When Alcaraz played the ATP Finals in Turin in November, everything looked set. Then the document arrived, and the document said something very different about who was actually in charge. Ferrero said the split came from Carlos's environment, not Carlos, the environment. Pablo Carreno Busta, Spanish pro, someone who moves inside these circles, drew the comparison others had been making privately, that some coaching relationships reach a natural ceiling regardless of what they produce. That the Toni Rafa ending and the Ferrero Alcaraz ending rhyme more than anyone wants to admit publicly. One critical difference. Toni stepped back because he decided his contribution was no longer necessary. His choice, his timeline, no contract, no deadline, no clauses. He said, "The job of a trainer is to make yourself dispensable. I think I did it." Nobody gave Ferrero that dignity. Nobody let him decide when he was done. So let's go back to Mallorca, 2017. Toni Nadal steps away from the greatest player he ever coached. No drama, no document, no deadline. He said later he made one mistake, announcing it in a Budapest interview before telling Rafa directly. That was his regret, a communication error. The kind of mistake you make when the relationship is so built on trust that the formalities feel almost irrelevant. Rafa found out through his father. Sebastian Nadal, Toni's own brother, was the one who broke the news. And even that awkward moment, even that imperfect ending to 27 years of relentless shared work, had a quality the Alcaraz-Ferrero split completely lacked. It was theirs. It came from inside the relationship, not from a contract, not from clauses, not from an environment pressing in from the outside with a deadline attached. Now think about what Toni Nadal was actually describing when he said the environment made this call. He wasn't being vague, he was being precise. In Spanish tennis, at this level, everyone knows what the environment means. It means the entourage, the family circle. The people who travel to the tournaments, sit in the player's box, have access to contract negotiations, and stand to gain, financially, professionally, reputationally, from who controls the direction of the career. Carlos Sr. has spent 30 years in tennis. His own playing career ended before it started because his family couldn't afford to sustain it. He built a club from his father's foundation. He ran an academy for decades in El Palmar. He watched his son become a 7-time Grand Slam champion under another man's coaching system at another man's academy, 60 miles from home. And then, when that son was the most valuable sports property in Spain, arguably in world tennis, a new academy started growing, with Alcaraz's name on it, in El Palmar, under Carlos Sr.'s direction. That's not evidence of malice. Let's be clear about that. It's not proof of anything corrupt or calculated. Fathers who love their sons build things for them. They always have, but there's a version of this story where the academy, the contract, the 48-hour ultimatum, the non-sporting clauses, all of it, points to one quiet, consistent, years-long effort to bring the center of gravity of Carlos Alcaraz's career back home. Back to El Palmar, back to the family, back to the man who started it all. And Ferrero, who poured everything into this project, who said he was hurting, who told Marca he wished he could have continued, got 2 days to decide if he could live with that. He couldn't. Toni Nadal said something else in those December interviews that barely got picked up. He said, "In tennis, the coach accompanies the player wherever he wants to go. Not where the coach wants to go, not where the academy is, wherever the player wants to go, and when the player's environment starts pulling harder than the coaching relationship, when the gravity of home outweighs the gravity of Villena, there's only one direction that ends in." Ferrero knew it, he said as much. At the end, the last word is Carlos. But what he didn't say, what he was too dignified to say, is that by the time that contract arrived on his table, the last word had already been spoken, by someone else, for Carlos. That's the question Toni Nadal was pointing at, without ever quite saying it out loud. Was Carlos Sr. acting in his son's interests? Genuinely? Was he? Because the 16-0 record, the Australian Open, Doha, the career Grand Slam at 22, all of that happened without Ferrero. Maybe the father read it right. Maybe pulling his son back toward home, toward family, toward a structure he controls, was exactly what Alcaraz needed to become the player he's becoming. Or maybe it was the thing a father needed, to finally be at the center of what his son built. Not watching from the box, running the academy, holding the contract, being the environment. One question, drop it in the comments right now. Pick a side and explain yourself. Is Carlos Sr. protecting his son's career or building his own legacy on top of it? Because those two things are not the same. And Toni Nadal, the man who coached a champion for 27 years and walked away when it was done, knows the difference better than anyone alive. Subscribe if you're new, like if this story deserved to be told. The next one lands soon, and it hits just as hard.